Dear students, welcome to the lecture series, World in Transition, a Social Contract for Sustainability. This lecture series is based on the flagship report of the German Advisory Council on Global Change of the same name. And in the coming lectures, you will hear about the themes and goals of this report. And today, what we're going to do is just try to introduce this and the report in its context. And we have the chance to have with us Professor John Schellnhuber, who is the chairman of the German Advisory Council on Global Change, and he's also the head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Schellnhuber.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for me.
I wanted to ask you, just as a starting question, why did you choose, you and the German Advisory Council choose the idea of a social contract for sustainability? What is at stake there?
I mean, the title is a program, of course, and it contains two key elements. So on the one hand, sustainability, and I'll come to that in a few seconds. The other thing is the social contract. Now, the social contract clearly is a reference to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the contrat social, which was a defining idea, at least, for the development of what you call the bourgeois society, modern democracy, all the things involved. But the sustainability issue simply means the human species on this planet has written a tremendous success story so far. That means we are the dominating species now, 7 billion going towards 9 or 10 billion. But the recipe for success, which is in particular based on fossil fuels, this recipe for success will drive us towards all types of crises. So it will not work anymore in the future. So the sustainability of the human enterprise on this planet is at stake. So that's the diagnosis, if you like, and we can elaborate on that, of course. The question is, what can we do? Can we change the plan, the course, or the recipe? Is there a plan B, if you like? And that is about the social contract, and this implies already that the solution will not be the conventional one. Go to the Secretary General of the United Nations and ask him to create a document, and everybody will sign up. And when we will somehow find a wonderful global solution, we do think that the way citizens on this planet define themselves and actually adopt ownership of our common future, so to speak, this way has to be changed, and it will not work through the conventional institution. So it is, if you like, Jean-Jacques Rousseau revisited, but at a global scale.
Okay, and these global problems you're talking about, in your report, there's this idea of a great transformation. And could you elaborate how this great transformation relates to this social contract and what it is about?
Yeah, this is really the connection between the two elements I just mentioned. The diagnosis is we are hitting all types of planetary boundaries now. We are too many people now on this planet, on this very small planet. We are doing business in the wrong way, at least in a non-sustainable way, and the natural resources are being depleted. I said there may be a way to deal with that problem, but this has to generate actually a great transformation. The great transformation means more or less entering a new stage of doing business on this planet. And doing business, I mean living, consuming, producing, enjoying yourself, whatever. That needs to be the transition or the transformation towards sustainability, to add some flavor to it, and that is the easiest part of it, I think, completely replacing fossil fuels by renewable energy sources. So But that's just one aspect of the whole pattern. And that is truly a great transformation because it only compares to the Neolithic revolution when we settled down, so to speak, on Earth and invented agriculture and husbandry and all these things. And the other great transformation, the Industrial Revolution, clearly. But this will be the third big transformation in the history of humankind, and it will hopefully propel us towards a level which can be sustained, while the other two can't be sustained. So, again, to make it crystal clear, here is the problem. The solution would be a great transformation, but how can it be brought about? Through a new social contract. So that's the idea. It's fairly simple. It's an equation with 3 variables.
So to get to sustainability, we need the great transformation.
We have to undergo that great transformation.
Which will lead to a new social contract.
Yeah.
And
so you got it.
Great. And when you were talking, the first thing I thought, yeah, we have gone through many changes in our societies. And then you mentioned the Neolithic revolution and the Industrial Revolution. What's different this time?
Many things are different, of course. I mean, I studied the other 2 transformations in quite some detail. And of course, you can't compare them to each other. I think one really important aspect is that what will have to happen now has to happen within the limited space our planet is providing. Because, you know, if you do an agricultural enterprise, say in the historic Middle East and so on, and, you know, the soil eroded, there was overgrazing, whatever, you could move on. If during the Industrial Revolution, the coal pits were exploited and depleted, so you moved on from Birmingham to wherever, within the Midlands, or went to Belgium or Germany, and so on. The same is true, by the way, for oil. If you reach peak oil in the United States, say, or in Libya, when you will move on to Venezuela or to the tar sands of Alberta. But this planet is becoming quite small for 719 billion people, and we cannot move on to Mars or Venus or to outer space. So we will have to further develop and still further raise our quality of life. There's nothing wrong with that. Within a given, a set space, if you like, defined by the planetary boundaries. One of them is clearly that we should keep global warming below 2 or 3 degrees. Probably even 2 degrees is too much, but we can talk about that. But there are other limits like the phosphorus cycle, the acidity of the ocean, and so on. I was part of a team that wrote in Nature, I think, a very seminal article on the planetary boundaries, where we define that safe operating space for humankind. The problem is that we have only been given that space, and we have to operate, develop ourselves, evolve further as the human enterprise within that given space. That means expansion is no more the name of the game. It is really intrinsic evolution, if you like. And that is a completely different game now.
So, if I understand correctly from what you're describing, the Earth is this kind of closed system, and we as humans are in it, and we're using things, and we should be careful not to use them past a certain level. That's what you call the planetary boundary, in order to keep on being able to use it.
I think you summarized it well. Maybe I give you another example. It is like, I mean, if you have a group of people in a fairly small room and they do not like each other, when there are several ways of dealing with that problem. You can kill each other, or you can just stop talking to each other, but it's preferable to killing, I guess. Or you can open the door and you leave the room and go somewhere else. But we have only this one room. That's the problem. So we have only the choice to either come to a social contract or to kill each other.
Which is not really a nice option. And I think this kind of metaphor you just bring in, it also brings in the idea of responsibility. Because if we only have this one room, and nobody wants to get to that scenario you just described. Right. So you need to cooperate, and to cooperate in a fair way. And in this social contract for sustainability, there's also the idea that we will be more. So there's the idea that we have to be responsible for people who are not born, because we think of the human species as one thing. And could you maybe say how this social contract to sustainability addresses this issue of intergenerational justice?
Now let me first say that even this one room where humankind is locked in is subdivided into many national compartments. That's the crazy thing. We have just this room, and we are all breathing together in that room, and if you cannot open the window, we will all suffocate, so to speak. And nevertheless, we have all these national compartments, and even the people sitting here or there in different corners don't want to talk to each other. Also in that very room, new children will be born, so to speak, and we also have to take care of them. So it is a very, very difficult situation. Now, I'm mentioning this because when we talk about responsibility, it's a responsibility beyond national boundaries and beyond generations or across generations. You know, in the Rio +20 conference, the motto more or less was, or is, whatever you call it, the future we choose. But it's particularly the future we choose for our children and grandchildren, of course. So this is the responsibility you mentioned. It is a responsibility of rich people for people who are less well-to-do, and it is a responsibility for cultures, so to speak, to respect other cultures which are less well equipped for dealing with the fierce competition of the global market, and so on. So it's a multi-dimensional responsibility, at least across space and time. So that's the thing we have to deal with. Now, your social contract question, of course, coming back to that. Here we have to simply look into the development of this idea of social contract, contrat social. You know, the volonté générale versus the volonté particulière. And the idea was clearly in the 18th century, through the Enlightenment, where not just Rousseau, but other great thinkers, Immanuel Kant, for example, just to mention a German in this context, came up with the ideas how you could finally come to a peaceful society, where everybody has, in a sense, a room of its own, or his or her own, and where you could live in peace together. And the idea was clearly that we will sacrifice a little bit of our personal interest, hand some power over to a central institution, a government, which can be elected or can be just assigned, however, so that we somehow are able to live together without killing each other. Now, the idea of social contract at the global scale means that you have to come to an agreement, a contract, even with generations still to come. And in a virtual way, to come to an agreement with peoples, cultures, societies you will never meet. I'll give you an example. By emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, simply by taking the car or whatever, you are in the last consequence, sinking certain islands in the Pacific. You will never meet with people whose home you are destroying. The island may sink only in 100 years from now. It may happen also in 20 years from now. But the interactions are across the planet. And the people who are destroying each other will never meet. We are not even aware of that. So the new social contract has to break that anonymity, if you like, with separation. And we think that this can be done even through the new social media, for example. I think a virtual global consciousness has to be created, where you virtually communicate even with people who are not born yet. Sounds very abstract and very weird, but I think it's the only adequate response to the predicament we are in.
Mm-hmm. So there's this social contract creates this responsibility towards other nations and towards other generations.
First of all, it will create a consciousness. That we are all linked together on this small planet, across space and time. That's the first thing. Once you have this consciousness, when you will either ask for institutions, global institutions, that could really deal with the problem, or many self-organization activities will happen. So
and these activities, they can take place at different levels, and I think that's something you discuss in length in the report. Right. It's also, you could call them instruments, or so what are the mechanisms, instruments, or activities that will steer us towards this global consciousness and responsibility?
I think the global consciousness is the easiest part of it, because we have the internet and many other technical options to communicate with everybody, more or less. Maybe not with everybody in China, because there are certain firewalls even within the virtual space and virtual reality. But I think in the end we will be able to really connect to almost everybody on this planet. The next part is, will anything organized, self-organized, pattern or activities, initiative emerge from that? And give you an example for that, something which is self-organized and fairly strong. It's with 350 ppm organization. I think the shortcut for it, or the shorthand for it, is 350 org, something like that. I'm on the mailing list. I've talked to some of the people. This is a movement to keep global CO2 concentration in the atmosphere to below 350 ppm. That would be in line with the 2 degrees target, for example, which is more or less adopted by the nation states. And for example, these were the people who were demonstrating in Washington, D.C. against this, pipeline from Alberta to Texas. Or they actually raised so much public attention that Obama in the end accepted that solar panels were put on the roof of the White House, which I don't know how many people are involved. It may be millions, or just 10,000, or just 1,000, but they seem to be everywhere now, in Australia, in Canada, in the United States, in Germany, and so on. So these are social forces emerging based on the consciousness, but using the social media. And these are informal movements, of course, but You could think of coalitions of such movements who could ultimately become so powerful that in a democratic election, a candidate would have to address them. And unless, say, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama would have to actually address that organization. Otherwise, they wouldn't get the final 500,000 votes they need to become president of the United States. This may be not a realistic scenario so far, but I could think of a future, maybe in 10 or 20 years, that without the approval of social networks and forces emerging there, you don't get elected anymore.
So you have a very positive outlook on environmental activism and grassroots movement and kind of the bottom-up processes in the transformation.
No, this is not I do not make any value judgment in a sense. I'm just talking about an option. Okay. I can see that something might emerge, that might become powerful, but it may be completely misled, it may even be manipulated, it may be flawed, it may have the wrong goals and the wrong means and so on. But it is a potential that did not exist 50 years ago. So we have to think of all possible options here.
And what about the potential of the states? Mm-hmm. Because that's something that is discussed a lot in the report, what the state can do, what a proactive state is. And I would like to hear more about these mechanisms.
Again, the state emerged, or the state, the nation state as we know it today, emerged probably after Waterloo in 1815, the Vienna Congress and so on, based on many ideas of people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and so on. It's a product of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, more or less. Now, this is a very anachronistic situation, of course, because 200 years later, where our planet now has been globalized by the economy and global consumption patterns, we still act and we are still fragmented in our global action by these 200-something nation states. And this is a very paradoxical situation, because if you go to a global conference like Copenhagen 2009, which was a complete failure, so I was there and I was close enough to the decision processes to really understand what happened, or if you go to Rio +20 or Johannesburg and so on, you see that in the end, by construction, it's very important to say this, by construction, institutional constructions, all the heads of state acting there are just prisoners of their national interest. Even if they would be willing to act in a different way as a human being, say Obama, Wen Jiabao, Angela Merkel and others, would say, I fully understand the global crisis. For the sake of our grandchildren, we have to change course. They couldn't do it, because if they would not act in the best national interest of a country, they would be killed by the media, by the electorates, their constituencies, and so on. I mean, I watched Barack Obama carefully when he gave his final talk in Copenhagen at the conference. And it was absolutely clear that he just talked to the American media. Every word was weighed in a way that it would have the biggest impact at home. So we heard so much international pathos, so to speak, but the addressees were all the national electorates. And that is an interesting thing. I thought a lot about it, because I think people like Obama, Merkel and so on, these are well-meaning people. I'm really convinced of that. And the same is true for many other leaders. But they are in this national straitjacket, so to speak. I think these people as individuals would be willing to sacrifice a part of their own wealth. They are concerned about their own children and so on. But because they act for a collective, if you like, a team, a society, an entire society, they feel they have to hold on to this interest. So it's a very paradoxical situation.
But there's still some things happening, and I mean some instruments that are beyond those individuals, those leaders, like laws. And there are courts, and you can bring about change through these things. And I think you described that, for instance, in the Great Transformation, in the report, there are those 3 areas that one should focus on, and one of them is energy. And in Germany, there's the feed-in tariff law.
Yeah, but that is a completely different thing. I mean, I fully agree with you. I think nation states can do a lot, actually. We are talking about global consensus of nation states. And tell me any development which maybe apart from the WTO, but that is clearly for even strengthening the conventional pattern of producing and consuming. Apart from that, do you know of any global agreement that is really directed towards sustainability? I don't know of any of them. So we're talking about global agreements as was planned to achieve and to strike in Copenhagen, for example. I mean, Rio in 1992 came up with a noble set of conventions, for example, 3 conventions, Agenda 21 and so on. That was the plan at least. But nothing came of it actually. But I'm not at all, I mean, we might come back to that because I do think that we could have global institutions who would be much more effective in the end than what we have right now. But for the time being, I think nation states actually can contribute to the great transformation through leading by example, definitely.
Okay.
And that is what you meant.
Exactly, that's what I was trying to get at, because you were describing how it was difficult to have this global consensus. But do we need a consensus to do the great transformation?
Yes and no. I think we can achieve the great transformation like the Industrial Revolution was realized in the end, starting from a tiny patch of England, Lancashire actually. Yes, it can be achieved simply because everything speaks for it. It's a win-win-win-win situation in the end, and I can elaborate on that. The big dilemma is that it may come too late for stabilizing the climate. For that, we probably would need a global plan, simply because the global emissions of greenhouse gases should peak before 2020. This is simple physics, we can calculate it. Otherwise, we will definitely overshoot the 2 degrees line, and then we will probably lose 90% of the coral reefs of this planet, maybe 50% of the species, and so on within a few decades. So, yes, the great transformation is almost unavoidable, but the timing is essential. And if we would have something like global institutions that really work, we could accelerate, we could shorten the phase of transition to a few decades only, and that's what really would be needed.
And in this idea of this transformation, there's also the idea of green growth. And you've been talking a lot about we can't keep on doing things as we've been doing them. We have to change. And I think this links to this green growth concept, which is also central. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit what this green growth idea is and how different countries perceive it.
I mean, first, again, the obvious part of the great transformation is switching from fossil fuels to renewables. Why? Because fossil fuels are distributed across this planet in a very inhomogeneous way, let's put it this way. So there are countries who have nothing and others have a lot. So this is creating a big distortion in global welfare, if you like. Second, we will be exhausted sooner or later. Oil, conventional oil, fairly soon. Coal will last for many centuries. But nevertheless, there is an end to it. Third, you have all types of nasty side effects, like global warming, which is more than just a tiny side effect. And fourth, it is very expensive. Drilling into the deep sea, like the Brazilian now proposed to do or intend to do, the so-called pre-salt formation of the coast of Brazil, they have just provided $200 billion for doing that. That's a lot of money. While if we would switch to renewables, we would have no costs at all in principle. I mean, not in the long run, because the sun is shining for free, as far as I know, at least. You have upfront investments, clearly, but they can be handled. You have no side effects, and the most important thing of all, sun, wind, waves are all over the planet. Everybody, more or less, has access to them. That's completely different from the petroleum sort of all crammed into the Middle East. So it is a win-win-win situation, clearly. That's why I think it will emerge, but the timing is really is extremely important. And green growth, I think, is maybe it's an oxymoron. That's one thing, but that is probably too complicated, so we will not dwell on it. I actually have given my own definition on that. I would say economic development, increase of prosperity for everybody is wonderful, but keep it within the limits of the planetary boundaries. So if you would say, yes, we accept a few what we call guardrails for the climate, for the biodiversity, for the ocean, and so on, then there's nothing wrong with growth. Growth, maybe even quantitative growth. But it would have to respect certain planetary boundaries. Now, the people, that's my definition, the people who have invented this term of green growth just want to serve two masters at the same time, the North and the South. Growth is the key word for the South. It means get us out of poverty. If you really look at a country like China, there are many rich people there, probably many billionaires already. So it is not precisely the right description of the state of affairs. The green is for the North, that means preservation, conservation, nature, sustainability. And so just satisfying the two hemispheres, if you like, at the same time is just cheap talk, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Well, if it's cheap talk, and it's also this kind of difficulty to talk at the global level, what you're just describing. And maybe we could move to the more national level to
but
talk.
Before we do this, I'm happy to do that, but I give you my interpretation of how the world is really divided. It's not divided into North and South.
Okay.
As we all experience, if we cross the equator, there is no big wall.
No, there's no wall.
That was a joke. No, the world is divided in rich and poor. And that is the real problem. If you try to analyze the climate problem, it is the upper middle classes of China, Brazil, India, of course, Europe, Canada, Australia, United States, South Africa, and so on. Maybe 1 billion people who create all the problem, and the rest do not even have a chance to destroy the climate. They have no access to the resources. They cannot afford to drive a SUV or things like that. And the same is true for many other problems on this planet. So it is an international alliance of those who do business as usual and have a lot of profit of that, or accrue a lot of profit. And there is an international alliance of people who just try to survive, if you like, or lead a fairly miserable life, and certainly do not contribute to the global crisis. So it's not north-south against south, it's rather rich against poor.
Wherever they're located.
Wherever they are located.
Which makes the problem more difficult.
Which makes the problem, on the one hand, more difficult, but here we could think of a social contract between the have-nothing on this planet, the poor, because if we have access to, say, the social media, they could organize themselves as a new force on this planet, actually. And maybe that is the confrontation we will face in the future. But now to the national.
Yeah, because I'm wondering, in the report, This Great Transformation, it describes the global process, but it also focuses on states and what states can do. And I think with every problem, when you look at the very big picture, there are many things that seem to conflict, but if you take a look at individual elements, then maybe they're easier to deal with.
No, absolutely. I mean, in order to be a realistic, I just sort of sketched a global vision which may come into being or not, and it may not even be desirable. I'm just saying the future is open to many surprises. And this question of rich against poor, this question of ethics and justice, I mean, will have to be addressed. But if we just try to think in terms of the current state of the world, realpolitik, as the Germans say, real politics, so to speak, then we have the nation states, and we have the global crisis, climate crisis, and many other crises. Now, of the 200-something nation states, 5 or 6 may draw the right conclusions and decide that they want to act and want to be part of this great transformation. Say a country like Denmark, a fairly small country, but if you go to Copenhagen, you will find many people riding a bicycle, enjoying themselves. They have probably the highest quality of life, at least in Europe. And they have just decided to completely go carbon neutral by the year 2050. Completely.
The city of Copenhagen?
No, the entire country.
Denmark?
Denmark has just decided.
Okay.
And that is, and nobody opposes to that. We all think this is a wise decision. So it's almost like a social contract between the parties and the citizens and everybody. Now Denmark is a small country and a small economy, and so let's move to Germany. Germany is the 4th biggest economy in the world, and in a completely democratic and legitimate way, Germany decided to phase out nuclear after Fukushima within 11 years, and to nevertheless honor our climate pledges. That means keep on decarbonizing our society. Now, if that works, if it turns out without destroying our competitiveness and so on, this will be a shining example for other countries. I guess Japan is extremely interested because they are in a similar situation. They will restart a few of their nuclear reactors, but public opposition is so strong that there will be an end to nuclear energy in Japan before long. So let's move on to the biggest of all countries then.
So these were the pioneers countries, like the two examples that other countries will want to follow.
But there is a third, at least semi-pioneer country, that is China, right? Okay. And that is the biggest of all. China is now not yet decided where to put all their eggs, so to speak, not in just one basket, in many baskets. But if China would come up in the next 5 years plan with the scheme, yes, we will we have tested many energy sources and so on. We find that the renewables will be our best hope when this will tip the global economy in the end, because other countries will have to follow. So yes, I do think that at various scales, nation states can lead by example. We are all guinea pigs. Germany is now a global guinea pig. Denmark is going to be a guinea pig, and even the big China is a guinea pig, a very, very big one actually. And if some of these experiments will turn out to be successful, then it will have an impact on the global course of affairs. But I give you one more example. I just met a very interesting gentleman from Qatar.
Okay.
So that is the biggest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases, and also the richest per capita country in the world. And this gentleman intends to completely transform agriculture in Qatar and later on other sectors of the country towards zero carbon. Mm-hmm. So they depend on water through desalination. And within the next 10 years, we want to completely transform the desalination process towards renewable energy. So it should be solar energy that will drive the desalination. And I asked him, how much do you want to invest? Well, he said $25 billion over the next 10 years. And he's serious about it. So if one country, a pioneer country from the OPEC, from the Middle East, they have the means, they have the sun, if they have the will to join the great transformation, that again will send a tremendous signal into the international community. So these are 4 examples.
For very different examples also.
Very different. Yeah. That's why I have picked them. Mm-hmm. Completely different cultures, autocratic systems, democratic systems, in the south, in the north.
So it seems interesting because a few minutes ago we were talking about all these contradictions,
mm-hmm.
and now at this level it seems much more doable. It seems like states can take commitment and decisions. And I was wondering, in the Qatar example, these 25 billion investment, I guess they're not all going to come from the government. There's going to be a lot of private sector investments.
I really don't know,
okay.
Because these are people who say, if I want to invest 25 billion, I will,
okay.
Wherever the money comes from. In the end, it comes from the oil, of course, or from the gas, but there's nothing wrong with that if you use it for the transformation. The important thing is, so I'm glad you made this remark again, these are national examples, but they are not orchestrated through global institutions, but they are orchestrated, if you like, through a global discourse on these problems. Because when I met with this gentleman, he was well informed. He had read our report, for example. He knew about what certain publications we have made and so on. So there is this global forum of science, information, media, and so on. And this is the fertile ground in which certain national examples can thrive in the end. So yes, we have a globalization when it comes to the diagnosis of the problem, but whether this country A or B or C will really adopt the right plan to act is a very erratic process. I think it's even a chaotic process, and you don't know when and where. By the way, it depends on personalities, leaderships, all types of accidental and incidental circumstances. So I believe that these elements of the great transformation will pop up here and there, now and then. The question is only whether this will gel, if you like, coalesce rapidly enough and widely enough in order to bring about a transformation in time.
Yeah, and that's a bit what you're trying to do with this flagship report. You're trying to lay out, this is a possible path, this is things that states can do, firms can do, individuals can do. And so you're, in a way, the report itself is trying to accelerate this. And I wanted to ask you, when the WBGU put this report together, who did it have in mind? Who should this report talk to? And now you're saying you're surprised, like this person from Qatar has read it. Do you think it has more influence than you thought it might have had, or?
I mean, first of all, our job is, and this is a clear mandate, we have a mission to fulfill. We have a mandate from the German government to provide the scientific evidence how to deal with certain problems arising these days, climate problem, biodiversity, and so on. We are just advisors, actually. Yeah? We are not part of the decision making, to be absolutely clear. So the conventional thinking would be, yes, you put together that report, you hand it over to a decision maker, and then it will be put into a drawer and forgotten forever. But sometimes happens. Now, what we do is, of course, a dual strategy, and the government is very happy with that. So this gets published as well and put on the internet and so on. And when it's out of control, of course. A good idea is always out of control. People may adopt it. It can be can be like an infectious disease, actually, very contagious. And if it's a really good idea, it will pop up in the most distant corners again. So the proof is in the pudding. If you do such a report and you just open it to the public, it may be completely ignored, or it may resonate in very distant corners, and that's what obviously happens right now. And there are two reasons for that, I think. One reason is that it's a damn good report. I say this in all with all sort of decency I can provide here. The other thing is there are a number of really provocative terms involved, and that's very important. The branding of a report is important. The great transformation, a word like this, is of course something where some people immediately oppose and say, well, this sounds like the great leap forward in the Cultural Revolution in China, although we actually cited Polanyi, The Great Transformation, a book written in the middle of the last century, a very interesting book, so it's a citation actually, but it may provoke certain people. You talk about global sustainability, and you talk about the social contract. The social contract, even now, 200 years after Jean-Jacques Rousseau, people still think, well, this is just about, it's the preparation of a revolution, le terreur, so to speak. It is something which is too dangerous to play with, actually. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau never had in mind that there will be a Robespierre later on and there will be the guillotine. He just thought, you know, if you read these famous first sentences, humans are born free, but everywhere they are in chains. Mm-hmm. This is still true today. The chains may be economic chains or social chains, whatever. So he had a great vision, and we just refer to that great vision. But nevertheless, you will find all types of provocations. And a provocation is good in the end, because there will be enemies to our thinking, and there will be people who try to discredit our thinking. But there is a huge dialogue going on about it. And the people who are well-meaning and the people who are willing to read the real text will find that we have delivered a great piece of work. And the power of ideas, as I said, is amazing. Actually, the very German Advisory Council on Global Change was the body that instigated the 2 degrees target.
Yeah.
which is now something like
Commonplace.
a commonplace among the 200 or so nations. So the power of ideas is tremendous, but you have no guarantee that an idea will really unfold like that. You have to have 100 good ideas, and maybe one of them will survive, but it's worth.
And so this report that people will click on the website and download and read, what does it say about individuals, how they can go about being part of this process? I mean, you mentioned at the very beginning of the interview this kind of environmental activism, but what about people who don't necessarily identify with activists? Because a lot, what you describe as this huge system where some things are wrong, like the way we consume, the way we do things. So how do you think people can go about this? And also not just people who live in Germany or in France, but also people who live in Mali or in India.
Okay, let's talk about Mali later. That's an interesting place. But first of all, human beings are at least three-dimensional. They are behaviors. They behave somehow. You take a bike or a car. They are consumers. So if you go to a supermarket, you can have a choice what to buy. And they are voters in general, in many countries at least. But even in China, you have a certain influence on the institutions and so on. So you can pick the party you vote for. And that means individuals are, in the end, the ultimate sovereigns of our world. Just take the consumer. I mean, I recall very well the time when there was still this apartheid regime in South Africa. And when certain activists, certain individuals and so on started to say, you have to boycott fruit coming from South Africa or other products. It became extremely powerful. In the end, it couldn't be ignored by national governments anymore. And that was, I think, in the end, the reason why the system could not survive. They had all the military means and so on to suppress the black majority, but internationally they couldn't survive like this. I could imagine that consumers will understand that buying the wrong thing contributes to destroying the planet. Now, they may not mind for themselves, but they will begin to mind for their children, I'm absolutely sure. That makes a huge difference. And I also think in the longer term that in the voting, in democratic voting, sustainability issues will become an important element again. Of course, short term, the economy has to thrive and so on. No, we don't want to lose our money in the euro crash and so on, things like that. But I think this consciousness, the long-term needs will sink into our culture, even in our culture of consumption. So, yes, individuals can change everything if they are still willing to communicate with each other and to address the issues at stake. But again, it's a question of timing. I would be a complete optimist that the great transformation through individuals, through pressure groups, through the economy, we haven't talked about the economy yet, through nation states, even through the United Nations Secretary General, but this great transformation will be achieved. The only question is, will it be achieved in time? And the sense of urgency, that is one of the hallmarks of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. We always try to calculate when do things have to happen. So targets and timetables are absolutely crucial.
And how does this link to the economy? You just said we haven't talked about it yet.
Yeah, the economy is here like always, a sort of ambiguous actor, because on the one hand, I mean, I talked at Rio Plus 20 to a lot of CEOs of big companies, and they say, well, in the end, we have to make profit. That is the only goal of our company. But it may not be possible anymore to make profit if you are not also addressing certain issues of sustainability, because your consumers will walk away from you. So it's a lot about greenwashing and green branding and so on. That's one part of it. So I guess a number of enterprises simply want to keep their consumers happy. And if these consumers want green products, they will sell green products, of course. But on the other hand, we are now in a phase of transformation anyway, because there are these other options again in the energy system. Solar industry is quite powerful already, simply because you can deliver energy at prices which are already competitive. If you compare it to, say, oil you have to drill in the deep sea, which is very costly and very risky and so on. So there is already, parallel to the conventional energy system, I call it the fossil nuclear system, or the fossil nuclear complex, there are already big pockets of sustainable energy systems emerging. And they're becoming more and more powerful. And here, nation states, of course, by setting the right framework conditions, can, of course, strengthen these pockets and widen these pockets. And so you have a competition between the old industrial system and the new industrial system. And according to what you find if you study the history of industry and industrial developments, you need about 15 or 20% of the new system when it tips the entire makeup into the new state. And I think we are very close to that. So if a few of the big companies, like Siemens, General Electric, and so on, say, we are all for the new way of producing, distributing energy, or we are all in favor of building sustainable cities, or we are all in favor of closing the loops of production and consumption, then this may become the dominant mode of operation in the economy.
It sounds from a lot of things you say that a lot of elements are already there. A lot of technologies are already there. There's already maybe not this, you also said the easiest thing to do at the beginning would have to have this global consciousness. So, and you have these pioneer countries which kind of set the tone and do the experiment beforehand. So it seems like lots of things are happening. And you were talking about Rio Plus 20. And I was wondering how you saw all the achievements that have been done since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and what you think will be the biggest challenges for the future to kind of bring these things together and go on with the transformation.
Whether there is a global master plan that brings all these things together, I really doubt. But first, let me address your remark. Many things are already around. We have elements. It's odd that these things are going back even further in time, actually. We talk these days a lot about electromobility. Now, the electric engine was invented before the combustion engine by a certain Mr. Siemens.
Okay.
So, it's...
The Siemens of the big Siemens company, okay.
It's that Siemens.
Okay.
And actually, New York City, I don't know when it was, I think in the 1920s or so on, they had 30,000 electric cars driving through the streets. So it's really amazing. At the same year, at Bell Labs in the United States, a famous physics think tank, actually creating, I think, 20 Nobel laureates in physics and so on. At the same year, I think it was 1954, the transistor was invented. That actually created our electronic industry and changed the way we communicate across the planet. I had the privilege to actually have my office next to John Bardeen, who was the inventor of transistor when I worked in California. Okay. So I met him and I talked to him, great man. He really changed history through his invention. But in the same year, the solar cell was invented at Bell Labs. So, more than 50 years ago, and only through the German feed-in tariff, decided a few years ago, the breakthrough towards, the right scale of exploitation of solar energy was achieved. So it is really funny that we have most of the elements there, and not just 20 years ago, maybe 100 years ago. We just have to put together the jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
But now to address your question, I do not think that there will be a mastermind with a master plan and a master timetable who will put all this together. You will have various pockets, so to speak, of innovation and transformation, and we only can try to intensify, accelerate, and sustain a global dialogue, a global communication, so that these pioneers of change identify each other and recognize each other and work together. So it will be rather a bottom-up collaboration of nation states, companies, social networks, individuals that bring about the transition. Now, I'm a physicist by training, a theoretical physicist, and I've studied for many years the theory of phase transitions.
What is that?
It's like, a phase transition is if you boil water from one state of matter, liquid, you go into gas, or if you lower the temperature, then you will have ice emerging from water. That's a phase transition. The state of the matter is changing in a completely fundamental way. If you study that, you see precisely that. First, small pockets of the new phase emerge, and when networks of the various pockets spread across the whole body. And in the end, the whole system is tipped into the new state. Now, with a little bit of physics understanding, I think we can even conceive and understand how this great transformation could come about. That will be my next lecture.
And you've been through a lot through this story. I mean, you've been telling a lot about your meetings with different people at different places, so you know a lot about the processes and the history of this transformation. And as a scientist and as an engaged scientist in that topic, what was your biggest disappointment, and also what keeps you going? Because it seems like there are lots of obstacles. So I was wondering, what is...
Yeah, let's start with the motivation. That's easier for me to explain. It's very simple, actually, because it's a lot of frustration. I mean, of course, I have my scientific successes. I mean, you get cited, you are acknowledged by your colleagues and so on, and which is based on very hard work, as you can imagine. But within the scientific community, you find many allies and many people with whom you can exchange ideas. So that's one thing. But nevertheless, you get frustrated if you are able to describe the problems to be addressed by decision makers in very clear terms, in very compelling terms, I guess, and nothing happens. But believe it or not, I have a 4-year-old son, and who is the sunshine of my life, clearly. And actually, I cannot stand the idea, the prospect, if you like, the perspective that I would release my son into a world that is going into chaos. So that is a very strong motivation. Biggest disappointment? Okay, let's be blunt. The biggest disappointment is the United States of America. Simply because this is a country I tremendously admire. I have worked in California twice in my life and have many friends who are in the Ivy League and at the finest institution of research you may find in the world. But it seems that the Enlightenment is at risk in the United States of America. The way the Republicans try to undermine, discredit the scientific evidence, and they get away with it, is really scary, I have to say. I think if the United States would find back to the course of enlightenment and the many wonderful things it has given to the world, then it would be much easier to bring about a great transformation.
And on a more contextual note, I mean, we've talked about many topics now, and everything that we've discussed and that will be discussed, so everything you're fighting for your son and for all the other children of this planet, this is going to be watched by many students that are also going to read the report, read more readings, write exams. And I was wondering, what do you wish them for this lecture series?
I mean, I had a very moving example or a very moving event when I went to Rio Plus 20. Actually, a group of young people interviewed me above the Atlantic in 30,000 feet height, so to speak. Were young climate ambassadors, as they call them. So school from Germany, people from Norway, people from Canada, together flying to the Rio Plus 20 summit. And I think they will return, not because of my interview, but because of the negotiations, were tremendously frustrated. So my advice would be, don't let the politicians steal your own future. Keep on going, keep on informing yourself, and finally, make the right decisions yourself.
All right, dear students, this is what you're in for in the coming lectures. So we wish you the best of luck, and maybe to brush up some French words because you'll have to check in the Enlightenment again. Goodbye.